Thanks, Vicky, for the introduction. I wanted to thank everyone for attending the TELUS Health Conference Series, and I look forward to presenting interesting trends that we've seen throughout 2020. So over the next 45 minutes or so, we'll take a closer look at certain trends observed within particular disease areas throughout 2020. We'll have an overview of the Canadian biosimilar landscape and an update on a couple of key legislative and regulatory items. And finally, we'll take a look into the gene therapy and drug pipeline. So in our first section, we're looking to cover the top 10 drug classes with further insights into the top 3. We'll have a follow-up on 3 other drug groups that have been of interest in the past few years, and that's the PCSK9 for cholesterol, CGRP inhibitors for migraine, as well as oral cancer therapy. We'll take a look at the top 10 individual drugs by our overall claims experience, as well as the top 10 drugs by cost per claimant. And finally, we'll take a look at the impact of COVID and provincial policy on the utilization of maintenance versus acute drugs. But first, a little quiz for the audience. And before I ask the first question, I'll just ask everyone to have your phone handy. So the first question is, what were the top 3 drug classes by eligible amount in Canada? Now, you can join by text by texting TELUS Health to 37607. And then once registered, you can text in your answer. So we'll give everyone a few seconds to answer. I think it takes about 30 seconds to come through. And you may recall this was part of Sean's presentation last week. So it's a little bit of a quiz on how well you remember our presentation from last week. That's great, lots of answers coming in. So it looks like option B has the most results. I'm just going to read that out for everyone, which is diabetes, MS, and asthma. Oh, we've seen option D come through in the end. Now, I can't quite make it out. I think it looks like 40-40. It looks pretty close. So what we'll do is we'll go to the next slide and we'll confirm what the answer is. So thanks for participating. So as you can see here, the correct answer was D, which was inflammatory disease, diabetes, and skin disorders. So thanks for participating. We've got a couple more sprinkled throughout the presentation. So the table we're looking at here does show the top 10 diseases, therapeutic classes across all claims in Canada. And one thing I wanted to point out that this in overall, we represented $5.1 billion of eligible cost, and these top 10 classes represent just about 60% of that. And as you'll see, if you notice the far right column, the rank in 2019, you'll see that there's been very little movement within the top 10, with only one change being made, which is a new entrant into the top 10, and that being for ulcers. The most interesting thing on this slide that I found is the second last column from the right, which is the number or percentage of claimants who've made a claim for a drug within each of these 10 categories. So you can see that the top 10 is made up of categories that are highly utilized, with close to 15% of claimants or more accounting for 5 of our top 10. Now, these are in categories such as skin disorders, asthma, depression, blood pressure, and ulcers. But on the flip side, we have the other 5 categories, and those are categories that typically have higher cost treatments, which are utilized by close to or under 5% of our claimants, going right down to as low as 0.2% of claimants for multiple sclerosis. So over the next few slides, we'll focus on the top 3 categories, that being inflammatory disease, diabetes, and skin disorders. Now, these 3 encompass 31.5% of all of our eligible costs. So as mentioned, the first category we're going to take a look at is our number 1 category, which is inflammatory disease. I'll quickly orient you to the slide that we're looking at, and this is the same way for the next few slides. So you'll see across the top the total eligible cost in 2020, and for inflammatory diseases, it was just under $635 million, representing a 6.6% increase from the year before. Across the top of the chart, we have the 5 products that you see below, along with their average annual cost on top, and the total growth compared to 2019 in the percentage beside the name. So we'll start with the top one. You'll see the purple line representing Remicade does continue to grow in total eligible cost. Now, this is despite multiple biosimilars on the market and the introduction of provincial biosimilar policies over the past year or so. So this is interesting and could be due to a couple of factors, that most likely the continued use of the originator Remicade in provinces where biosimilar switching policies or programs are not in place, and potentially a higher utilization in existing patients who may be progressing within their disease. The second product we're looking at is the green line, and that's Humira. So we've seen continued growth over the past 5 years, but with biosimilar entrants coming to market in 2021, and the potential for provincial policies to follow, this will be a molecule to follow throughout the year and the coming years to see how it progresses. The third product we want to look at is Enbrel in the gray line. Now, Enbrel, very similar to Remicade, has biosimilars on the market, which are part of provincial biosimilar programs. And we've seen sort of year over year flat or a decrease in terms of the eligible cost attributed to Enbrel. And finally, I wanted to highlight the very bottom. We're just going to skip over Simponi, but at the very bottom is Inflectra. Now, Inflectra is a biosimilar for Remicade and part of many provincial biosimilar programs. And we know from recent years and past years that biosimilar uptake has been very slow, a few percentage per year over time. But as you can see in 2020, we saw a jump of 37.7% specific to Inflectra. Now, we believe this is pretty directly related to provincial biosimilar programs or switching programs and the awareness that raises around biosimilars on the market. But I would say the main takeaway from this slide really is that biologic originators such as Remicade, Humira, and Enbrel that have or recently have biosimilars on the market may lose market share over time with biosimilars entering the market, but it may or may not impact the continued growth of these products and the overall their overall cost. It just may slow down that trend. The second category that we wanted to look at is our number 2 category in our block, which is diabetes. As you can see across the top, the eligible costs within this category rose by close to 11% last year to $578 million. Now, this growth was largely driven by these 3 products, Freestyle Libre, Ozempic, and Jardiance, where we saw growth of 44.7% for Freestyle Libre, over 100% for Ozempic, and just around 20% for Jardiance. So I'll first touch on Freestyle Libre, which came to market in mid to late 2017, and since then has seen a rapid and continued growth. This is a flash glucose monitoring product which allows patients to wear a sensor on their arm for 14 days and take their sugar readings by hovering a device over their arm. So the annual cost of these sensors equates to approximately the similar cost of a user testing 8 to 10 times a day with test strips. Now, the one in the green here, which is Ozempic. Ozempic has seen a continued rise in utilization, effectively replacing Victoza as the first GLP-1 on the market, as the major GLP-1 on the market. Now, Ozempic is a once-weekly medication compared to the other GLP-1s, which are typically once daily. Now, we've seen this strong and continued growth, but there are actually currently studies for Ozempic at higher doses than on label, as well as the potential for the use in weight loss. And so while we do expect, it's possible that some of that is already built into the claims and the acceleration that we're seeing here in overall cost, but we do believe that if these studies become official indications or indications, then we're going to see a continued acceleration in the growth of Ozempic on the market. One factor that may impact Ozempic specifically was the entry of an oral version of the chemical semaglutide, or the brand is Rybelsus. And so this is something we want to keep track of over the year. And it may just be a shift of patients going from the injection towards the oral or new patients. And so it'll be interesting to see how these two products progress. Now, the last product on this slide is Jardiance, which is an SGLT2 inhibitor. And of note, the SGLT2 inhibitors and DPP4 classes do continue to dominate a good portion of the market as a class. And we've had up close to 25% of our claimants in the diabetes category have a claim for one of these two categories, SGLT2 or DPP4. Now, we know that there's a lot of evidence coming to market and coming from studies around use in cardiovascular patients and supporting their use there. And that's likely bringing forward when these drugs are being used compared to previous years, and also supporting and driving some of the growth we see in the category. Now, the main takeaway with diabetes is that it was, again, the number 2 disease category on our block and still showed close to 11% year-over-year growth. And we do expect that this will continue going forward. And the final category that we wanted to take a little bit of a deeper dive into was skin disorders. Now, we mentioned that skin disorders was number 3 with utilization from over 20% of our plan members. But of note, that 20% utilization is most likely driven from uses of topical agents such as creams and ointments, but the costs are likely driven from a smaller group of patients who are utilizing biologic drugs to treat their skin conditions. Now, I would say skin disorders as a category is a little bit tricky and a little bit hard to really understand, because a lot of these molecules first came to market with an indication to treat skin treatments, skin disorders. But over time, as we've seen with many biologics, as their indications grow and the scope of their indications goes beyond the initial disease state. And so some of these drugs do cover other indications such as Crohn's disease, ulcerative colitis, severe asthma, as well as nasal polyposis. So the fact is, it's really hard for us to drill down and understand how much of what we see within this category is really due specifically to skin disorders. Now, you'll notice that Stelara is the number 1 category and the number 1 drug in this group, far and above the rest at the bottom. And that most certainly might be driven by its use in GI indications. So what we want to do is just focus in on the bottom. And this is a basket of drugs that is mostly biologic drugs, but one interesting one here is Jublia. Now, Jublia is a non-specialty product. It's a liquid that is applied directly to the nail to treat nail fungal infections. And so, it's interesting to see that that type of drug is up here with all the other biologics in terms of overall cost. And so that's likely due to a high utilization and lots of plan members having claims for these drugs. It's worth noting for Jublia that it does appear to be close to the end of its patent life. But one thing with Jublia is, however, when generics come, since it's not covered on many, if at all, any provincial plans, the generic savings won't be, the 70 to 80% savings that we typically expect. It'll be closer to 15 or 20%. So that was it for the top 3 categories. This next section is just a follow-up on 3 of those categories that we had over the last few years that we have highlighted, and that will be cholesterol, migraine, and cancer. So the first one, and what we really wanted to highlight across these 3 groups, and we'll start off with cholesterol, is the growth in total number of claimants or the lack thereof. So this is the top right corner. We see that the total number of claimants in the overall cholesterol group actually decreased last year by 2.6%. But noting that the number of claimants making a claim for the PCSK9 inhibitors grew by 13%. And now these are biologic drugs, and the number of patients is only 0.4%, but it's accounting for 11% of costs. We see a very similar trend with migraine, where we only saw a growth of 0.1% of patients across the whole disease class. But specific to the CGRP inhibitors, we saw an increase of 80% last year. Again, 2.2% of patients accounting for 24% of costs within the category. And finally, in the cancer class, we saw a decrease of 3.1%, but an increase of these three products, which are oral take-home cancer therapies, by 5%. And so when looking at these three, I would say, it's possible that plan members are likely progressing or not achieving adequate control with existing or prior treatment options. And so we see that there's shift within the categories. And now, although certain categories, like we've highlighted here, are not growing in overall number of patients, pockets within these categories are driving growth in the overall spend, showing a shift of existing patients within the class to these newer treatments. And so for the classes I've highlighted here, typically a prior authorization program can support the use of these newer, costlier treatments for plan members who do require them. Now, before we get into our top 10 drug products, we have another quick poll for the audience. So the question here is, which drug product moved up the top 10 products by eligible amount the greatest? And just in case you weren't able to join for the first question, please text TELUS Health to 37607. And otherwise, you're ready to answer our second question. We'll give everyone about 30 seconds. I'll give everyone a clue. It links back a little bit to the top 3 drug categories. It's great to see the live results. Okay, we'll give it another 10 seconds, see what comes through. Great, so it looks like 62% of our participants have answered correctly, which is D, Ozempic. Thanks for your participation. That was great. And so, yeah, that's correct. So D, Ozempic, as you'll see from this chart, the top 10 products by eligible amount, Ozempic actually moved up 10 spots from number 16 last year all the way to number 6. And the takeaway here, I would say that's expected. We've seen over 100% year-over-year growth on the utilization of Ozempic in terms of eligible cost. But the other takeaway here, all 10 of these drugs are for disease states within our top 10, which is no surprise. We have 3 inflammatory disease treatments and 3 diabetes treatments within the top 10 for just those top 2 categories alone, again, which is no surprise. So the next slide here, what I wanted to focus on was taking a look, we've talked about the top 10 disease categories. We've talked about the top 10 drugs in terms of overall eligible costs. But what we're looking at here is the top 10 most costly products on average per individual claimant. And these 10 products represented $47.3 million in eligible costs last year. And this was for 104 patients. So you can really see that the average annual cost of these drugs is quite high. So one thing I wanted to do was I wanted to see how this has progressed from 5 years ago. So I took a look back at some numbers in 2016 and noted in 2016 when we focused on the top 5 drugs and a similar view at that time, the range started at $250,000. You can now see that we have 10 drug products eclipsing $280,000 per year on average per claimant. Now, these are typically drugs to treat rare disease and are often weight-based drugs, in which case your annual cost can fluctuate drastically. But really, what I wanted to highlight here is just that growth in these ultra-high cost drugs, where 5 years ago, the top 5 was starting at $250,000, and now we have top 10 starting at $280,000. Now, these are the most expensive drugs today that we have had claims for, but stay tuned to see what we'll show you a little bit later as it relates to gene therapy in terms of what's coming to market or on the market. So the final trend slide that I wanted to review takes a closer look at the split around acute versus maintenance drugs. So what we did here was we took a 2-year view to really highlight that typically it's a very stable split. There's no changes between acute and maintenance drugs over time from a percentage basis. But what we'll do is we'll focus in on this period of time, which is February to September 2020, around when we saw newer policies being implemented by the provinces around protecting the drug supply. But also with a lot of the uncertainty around the risk of COVID at the time, we heard that many people were not accessing healthcare for minor or what they perceived were minor issues. So starting with the maintenance claims in dollars, which is the purple and gray line at the top, you'll see that during this period of time, claims moved higher. Maintenance claims moved higher. And we can really attribute this to the policies that were put in place to help protect the drug supply and shorten the day supply of each dispense. So typically where you would have normally seen one 90-day fill, we were seeing 3 30-day fills. And as such, we saw an increase in the number of maintenance claims. And then I believe once those policies and requests from government were kind of repealed, and we went back to normal 90-day supplies, we've seen the 2 lines normalize. But on the other hand, when we look at the bottom, we saw a significant decrease in the number of claims for acute drugs, things like antibiotics or pain management. Now, this we feel is more likely caused due to a hesitancy from the public in accessing healthcare for what they perceived were minor issues. And then we've seen that come back up a bit, but not to the same levels as pre-2020. Now, what the long-term impact of this will be in the system, in the healthcare system, has yet to be seen, but I know it's something that a lot of people are keeping a close eye on. So this wraps up our section on trend insights. The next section we're going to look at is the Canadian biosimilar landscape. We're going to take a quick look at some of the uptake figures from biosimilars, and then a view on what some of the provinces are doing. So this is a similar view you may have seen in the past, where we track the utilization of originator or the reference product against its comparator or biosimilars. And it's a very similar trend. Year over year, we see a slow and gradual uptake in market share of the biosimilars. I would say in 2020, we saw that increase a little bit from what we normally saw, likely due to the provincial policies that have been put into place. You'll see all three of these products, Remicade, Enbrel, Neupogen, all saw a decrease in market share compared to their biosimilar comparators. And even Neupogen dropped from 18 all the way down to 11%. This is a similar view for two products, Lantus and Neulasta. Again, looking at 2020 data, we saw a continued, but definitely an increased shift towards the biosimilars last year. With Lantus, I just want to point out that we did include Toujeo. While it's not a biosimilar, it's the same molecule, which is insulin glargine, as Lantus, but it is a more concentrated version, which allows patients who may have very high insulin needs to inject a much smaller volume of insulin each time. And that takes up about 19 to 20% of the market share for insulin glargine. So this next section is really focused on the provincial legislative landscape. And we know that biosimilars have been up and coming across the country for the past couple of years, although with very slow growth, but we did see greater growth in 2020. So we want to take a look at, from a provincial perspective, what has been implemented and what were the range of strategies that were used, and how does this compare in pharmacare provinces versus non-pharmacare provinces. So we'll start on the left with the pharmacare provinces and BC. So BC implemented a mandatory switch policy where the population of BC and the patients were given a fixed period of time where they needed to switch over to a biosimilar product if they were on the reference original, after which point of time they would no longer have coverage for the originator, and if they wanted continued coverage, they had to be on a biosimilar. So that's what we refer to as mandatory switching, where there's sort of a clean cutoff date. In Manitoba, they've tried a different strategy, which is called the tiered biologic reimbursement. So Manitoba has determined tier 1 products across various indications, and they've determined those to be more cost-effective options. After which point, if you've tried and failed a tier 1 product, 1 or 2, you can move on to tier 2 products. In the non-pharmacare side, so we see Alberta has implemented mandatory switching this year, so very similar to British Columbia. Ontario did something a little bit different where they used formulary coverage. So typically where some of the originator molecules were only accessible via EAP or exceptional access program, their biosimilar comparators are listed on the regular ODB formulary requiring limited use. So the way they're promoting and preferring biosimilars is through the formulary listing. And finally, we have Quebec. Quebec, when they implemented their policy, they grandfathered existing patients, and then new patients only had to start on the biosimilar. So we've seen a few different strategies, and likely we believe that the remaining provinces are going to leverage similar policies from we've seen with the other provinces that are up here. And most recently, we've seen New Brunswick and Saskatchewan implement policies promoting biosimilars within the last couple of weeks. So we thought it'd be interesting to take a look at two provinces who implemented mandatory switching. So we looked at BC and Alberta and see how what happened in the province translated to the private payer space and the claims that we saw. So just quickly, this is mostly for background information. These are the dates that BC and Alberta had sort of their transition or transition deadlines. And to ensure we were comparing apples to apples, we just picked a basket of the same 4 molecules across both provinces, which are highlighted below at the bottom. So these are the originators in the middle and the biosimilar products that they would have had to switch to. Now, please note there are newer biosimilars on the market that are not all captured on this slide. So when we took a deeper dive into the claims, so the left, we have British Columbia, and the right, we have Alberta. Now, just to orient you to this slide, the green part of the bar represents the percent of members who are using a biosimilar product, and the purple represents the percent of members who are on the originator or the reference product. So we'll start with BC on the left. As you can see on the far left, this is when the mandatory switch began, and we saw quite a drastic decrease and sustained biosimilar percentage and biosimilar utilization ever since the policy went into force for these molecules. Almost a decrease all the way down to, or an increase of biosimilar utilization close to 90% now in BC. When we look at Alberta, who also implemented a mandatory switch policy, it's actually quite interesting to see their mandatory switch began on the far right. But as you can see, leading up to that date, and this may be a spillover effect of what's happened in BC, this may be just more awareness around biosimilars, but we already started to see a shift towards biosimilars in the province. And then once the mandatory switch began, we saw another jump, increasing biosimilar utilization up to 70%. Now it'll be interesting to see how this tracks over this year and the coming years to see if this is a sustained switch as we've seen in British Columbia. So this is a view on two provinces, pharmacare and non-pharmacare, on mandatory switching. But what does it look like in a province that hasn't implemented mandatory switching? So we wanted to take a look at Ontario. So this is the same slide in the same chart. So the green represents the biosimilar products and the purple represents the reference originators. So as you can see currently in Ontario, where there's no switching policy implemented, on our side, in the private payer space, we don't see the same uptake of biosimilar products. It's actually, we've got up to 14%, but nothing compared to the 80-90% we're seeing in the mandatory switch provinces. So this is all to say that really it's very interesting to see how provincial policy, again, can impact what we see in the private payer space between provinces. The final slide on biosimilars is looking at the overall or the relative cost per claimant, same thing for these biosimilar products and biologic products, over the last 2 years, highlighting BC in green and the rest of Canada in purple. So as you can see over time, as we saw an increase in biosimilar utilization, we've seen the relative cost drop by about 31% in BC. Whereas in the rest of Canada, we've seen the relative cost increase by about 18%. So, we do know that Alberta is baked into the rest of Canada here. And so as more provinces implement biosimilar policies, it'll be interesting to see over time, if we look at it province by province, since that's something we might look at going forward. So that brings us to the end of the biosimilar landscape section. We're quickly going to touch on two legislative items, one being national pharmacare and the other PMPRB. So the first one is national pharmacare, and I would say a movement towards national pharmacare strategy was announced in 2019 and reintroduced in 2020. Now, the proposed legislation, which is Bill C-213, outlined that provincial and territorial governments would be allocated a specific annual cash contribution from the federal government for this program, and under the requirement that they build a jurisdiction-specific plan that is comprehensive and universal. However, in February of 2021, the proposed legislation was rejected based on the basis that the bill oversteps on provincial and territorial jurisdictions. And we all know that in Canada, the provinces own healthcare for their own area. And so this bill was struck down. So moving forward, we expect that the federal government, they hope to continue to work with the premiers in the provinces and territories on a more collaborative approach to national pharmacare. But most recently, as last week, in the federal budget, there was nothing concrete around it other than continuing the discussion. And I think we may have expected that given the current environment that we're in. The second update pertains to PMPRB. Now, these regulations, the updated regulations were to go in last year and have been delayed twice with a new implementation date of July 1, 2021. Now, some of the key buckets are really looking at prices of drugs they're looking to, when they set the ceiling of the price, is to look at drugs within the same therapeutic class, the prices in other countries, and inflation rate changes. They were also looking to change the basket of countries that are referred to in terms of determining the pricing and the reporting requirements, but also what are the policies around enforcement and compliance to the policies. Ultimately, I would say, they're very complex, the changes that are coming, but ultimately our expectation for once the updated regulations are implemented is that it should lower the cost of drugs coming to market in Canada. So that's it for the legislative updates. Now, following a follow-on from the panel discussion that Daria hosted earlier today, I wanted to provide you with a quick overview of some recent gene therapy treatments, along with what the pipeline may look like. But first, our third and final polling question. Which of the following is not a characteristic of gene therapy? And I believe this was touched on briefly during the panel discussion earlier on. So as with the last couple of questions, we'll give it a minute or so for the results to come through. We'll give it another 15 seconds. But it looks like we have one in the lead. Great, thanks again for the participation. It looks like close to 70% of you picked typically, oh, sorry. There we go, typically manage or treat symptoms long-term, and that's correct. So managing or treating symptoms long-term is a characteristic of conventional therapy. With gene therapy, it's typically a one-time treatment and or potentially curative. Thanks for your participation on that last question. So we'll jump in and take a look at 3 products, 2 which are available today or approved today, but the first one being Glybera. Now, Glybera was developed over quite some time at the University of British Columbia, but it was never approved in Canada. It was approved in Europe in November of 2012 and launched at the equivalent of approximately $1.6 million as a one-time treatment. Now, the comparator to this drug for this particular disease is enzyme replacement therapy, and it has an annual cost of $300,000 per year for life. Now, with Glybera, outside of clinical trials and compassionate care, there was only one patient who was treated for this drug or one sale of the drug, and that may be why it was discontinued in 2017. Now, the next 2 are more recent. Luxturna was approved by Health Canada on October 13th, 2020. It's for the treatment of adult and pediatric patients with vision loss due to inherited retinal dystrophy, and it has a cost per eye of just over $515,000. So a one-time treatment cost just over $1 million. Now, for this disease, there's no existing therapy, and it often leads to complete blindness. So you can already see that the one-time cost of these drugs are well above what we saw sort of on our top 10 drugs this year. The last one I wanted to touch on is Zolgensma. Now, this was approved by Health Canada on December 15th, 2020 for pediatric patients with spinal muscular atrophy. Now, Zolgensma has a one-time treatment cost of $2.8 million and is now the world's most expensive drug. Now, the alternative would be Spinraza, which was formerly the world's most expensive drug, and Spinraza has a cost of $700,000 in the first year and $350,000 per year after, just over. So as you can see, there's 2 products approved in Canada today, but we wanted to look at the pipeline knowing that the cost of these drugs is ranging today from anywhere from $1 to $3 million. Now, this is just a snapshot of the gene therapy pipeline. And really what we wanted to share here is that the pipeline is strong. These are 6 products, but there are many others. And also, it's not too far in the future. We believe that possible market dates for these 6 products is anywhere within the next 2 to 3 years. So the discussion on the panel earlier today is quite relevant in assessing these products. So our last section is the drug pipeline, where we'll look at a couple of categories and disease states, but also a quick snapshot of what is currently with Health Canada. So when we took a look at Health Canada, now just a quick note, this is a snapshot from February 22nd of this year. There were 83 new drug submissions at the time, and typical to what we've seen over the past few years, a quarter of them are related to oncology. One other thing to note is biosimilars. There were 9 biosimilar submissions, but most of them were for products that already have biosimilars on the market today, and they're just new entrants to the same molecule. The second part of this slide is a generic product. So there were 152 submissions for generic products, and a couple of key areas we wanted to highlight was HIV drugs. Now, this is because HIV therapy can range between $10,000 to $15,000 per year. And so generics coming to within this disease state can have the potential to offer significant cost savings. And finally, at the bottom is diabetes. We know that diabetes is number 2 on our block. And so having potential for generics soon to market can offer some cost offset where that the disease state is growing rapidly. Now, as a PBM, of course, TELUS's position is to support the use of generic drugs throughout our drug plan offering, and we'll continue to monitor the drug pipeline for upcoming generics, which may provide significant cost offsets in an environment of rapidly rising drug costs, as we've seen here within the diabetes class and throughout our top 10. Of course, with all medications, there are certain situations where a patient may require a brand drug, and coverage of these drugs is typically based on the particular plan design. So the first specific disease area we wanted to focus on was spinal muscular atrophy. And we're going to cover some of the latest treatment options that have come to market in recent past. So SMA is a rare disease that is a leading genetic cause of death in infants. And children who live longer than 2 years gradually lose motor function and may need a ventilator to breathe. So the first product here is Spinraza. As mentioned, it has an annual cost in the first year of $700,000 and $354,000 per year after that. But Spinraza is an intrathecal injection. So, it does require specialized technique and is hospital-based. The second drug, which we just recently touched on through our gene therapy section, is Zolgensma, which is a gene therapy, as mentioned, to treat this disease and is a single injection, but with a cost of close to $3 million. And finally, Evrysdi, which is an oral liquid used to treat SMA. Now, this is important because as an oral liquid, it has the potential and most likely will be administered at home, and thus will have significant impact on private drug plans. Although the list price in Canada has not been announced yet, the average annual price in the United States ranges anywhere from $100,000 to $340,000 US. The next disease state we wanted to provide a snapshot on was cholesterol. So the first product here is Leqvio, which is also a PCSK9 inhibitor, joining Repatha and Praluent in this class. And we touched on cholesterol earlier. Now, the main benefit of Leqvio is that it's administered just twice a year, compared to every 2 weeks or every 4 weeks, as are Repatha and Praluent. We do expect the annual cost to be in line, though, with these products in and around the $5,000 range. We would say, though, this product has been approved in Europe, but it did run into some snags in the United States, and approval was suspended. And so we are waiting to see how that plays out. The third category in disease state, is cystic fibrosis. So cystic fibrosis is a rare genetic disorder that affects approximately 1 in 3,600 children born in Canada. So the cystic fibrosis category is slowly getting more crowded with more and more treatment options, which is great. Trikafta has been described as a revolutionary treatment in 2 ways. So as a triple therapy, it has shown significant improvement in clinical outcomes, but also it can treat up to 90% of the patient population, whereas other drugs typically target less than 10% depending on the genetic mutation. Now, the price of this drug in the United States is currently $311,000, and it has been approved by the FDA. It's currently with Health Canada, but we do expect it to be wrapped up in the next 4 to 6 months as it has an accelerated review timeline. The final category that we want to look at was multiple sclerosis. We know that MS was in our top 10, and we know most recently over the last few years, there have been new entrants into this class. So these are 3 entrants, and we believe this brings a total number of MS treatments up to 19. So regarding Kesimpta, it was approved in January of 2021 and has a similar list price to other products in the $20,000 to $30,000 range. Vumerity is an interesting product as it's very similar to the existing product Tecfidera that's on the market, but improvements have been made which give this drug a much better side effect profile. And finally, the third entrant that we're looking at is ponesimod. Now, again, this drug is going to be in the, we expect around $20,000 to $30,000 range, as it is with all the other newer MS treatments. So the real takeaway from multiple sclerosis is we're continuing to see new entrants into this class, providing more treatment options for patients. But as with other treatment options within this class, they are considered higher cost treatments in the $20,000 to $30,000 range. And we believe that we'll continue to see MS in our top 10 going forward. So thank you very much. I just wanted to highlight some key messages before wrapping up. So we know that the top 10 drug classes, while the top 10 stay the same, they do continue to grow within them. We've looked at the impact of provincial biosimilar policies and how that translates to the private payer space. We do expect and continue to see the growth in the ultra high cost drugs, if we say those are over $250,000 on an annual cost. We took a quick look at the future of gene therapy treatment options, and we expect that more will come to market in the next 2 to 3 years. And finally, when looking at the pipeline, we know that new biosimilar entrants are slowing down while we're seeing submissions for biosimilars for products that already have some. So we're seeing a growth in the number of biosimilar options for particular molecules. Thank you very much, and I look forward to your questions.
Thanks, Vishal, for that informative presentation. It's now time for Q&A. As a reminder, we invite you to submit your questions through the Q&A panel accessible on the right side of your window. So while those questions come through, I'll ask you a question. With all the announcements these days from provinces for biosimilar switching programs, how can private plans also benefit from or align with the provinces that have implemented biosimilar management policies?
Yeah, that's an interesting question. I would say a couple of different ways. It's possible to use prior authorization criteria to align with what the province is doing, but also as we gain more indication in terms of, or more information around indications that patients are using these drugs for, using a reference-based program that matches on indication and or just a molecule is a way to align with the province, whether it's a pharmacare province or a non-pharmacare province.
Okay, thanks, Vishal. So I'll take a question from the Q&A panel. Do we expect PMPRB to have only an impact on public payers, or can we expect an impact on private payers as well?
Yeah, great question. And so because PMPRB's price is the ceiling price across public and private payers, we would expect that if the overall price is lowered, that's going to benefit both public and private payers.
Great, thanks. And one other question from the panel: what explains that that some biologics still have costs going up per claimant, as we saw with some of the biologic trends?
Yeah, for sure. I would say if it's a biologic that has a biosimilar, it could be due to the provinces that do not have switching policies in place, and so there is continued use of the originator. Without a switching policy, patients who are already started on it will continue to be on it, and so they may be progressing and may require higher doses depending on the molecule. But that's a likelihood of why we see continued growth.
Thanks, Vishal. There was a question about your one slide about submissions under review that says 2020, and they're asking if it should be 2021, which I believe.
Yes. Yeah, I apologize. That was February 22nd, 2021.
Thanks for clarifying. So I'll just ask you another question about biosimilars. So biosimilars that you've covered in the drug pipeline appear to be for molecules with biosimilars already on the market. Do you expect that with more options, the future cost of biosimilars will fall?
Yeah, it's a good question. Because biosimilar pricing is linked to PCPA and it's all transparent, it may not fall further just by having more options. But it'll be interesting to see when that second wave of biosimilars for products that, for biologics that are on the market comes. As we've seen now, sort of a group of biosimilars and more entrants within that same group. I think the next wave will be for future products.
Thanks, Vishal. I think we have time for one more question before we get into closing statements. So with the rising costs of diabetic therapies, how can we design plans to support diabetic patients while also managing costs?
Yeah, that's a good question. Great question. I would say there's different strategies. There's step therapy as an option where you try to ensure your patients are progressing through the guidelines as set out by Diabetes Canada. It's possible to use prior authorization, but that's very tricky because there's so many. It's a very high utilized space, so prior authorization may not be the best way, but it's one option, and you can select particular classes. So it's just about your experience in particular and how to manage. But those are a couple of options: prior auth and step therapy, to help sort of ensure that those who require products access it, but while also managing some of the rising costs.
Great, thanks, Vishal. I think we've run out of time for Q&A, so we'll just wrap up. Thanks so much, Vishal, for that informative presentation.